What if the silence you're confused about is not rejection, not avoidance, but restraint born from too much love? What if she stepped back, not because she didn't care, but because she cared more than she should have? Stay with me, because this will challenge everything you think you know about distance, love, and emotional self-control. Silence is not always avoidance. We have been conditioned to believe that when someone goes quiet, when the messages slow down, when the presence becomes less visible, it must mean disinterest or emotional withdrawal. But this belief comes from a culture that equates constant access with care and noise with connection. In reality, silence often carries more emotional weight than words ever could. It can be a deliberate pause rather than an escape, a conscious decision rather than a careless disappearance. When someone truly does not care, their absence feels empty and effortless. There is no tension, no internal debate, no emotional gravity attached to it. But when silence is chosen by someone who feels deeply, it is rarely simple or easy. It is often the result of intense internal negotiation, where emotions are felt strongly but expressed carefully. For emotionally aware individuals, especially those who value depth and self-respect, silence can be a form of emotional regulation. It is not about ignoring someone, but about managing one's own emotional exposure. When feelings begin to grow in an environment that feels uncertain, inconsistent, or emotionally unsafe, silence becomes a boundary, not a wall, but a line drawn to prevent emotional overextension. In these moments, silence is not passive. It is active restraint. It is the effort of choosing not to say what the heart wants to say, because the mind understands the consequences of saying it too soon, too often, or to someone who may not hold it with care. There are times when silence is chosen because speaking would create vulnerability without security, when reaching out would mean investing more emotionally than the situation can sustain. This kind of silence is heavy because it goes against instinct. The instinct to connect, to clarify, to seek reassurance. It requires self-control to resist that pull. It requires awareness to recognize that constant communication does not guarantee emotional closeness, and that sometimes stepping back is the only way to preserve dignity. In this context, silence is not a withdrawal from the other person, but a return to oneself. It is the space where emotions are processed rather than projected. Silence can also be a response to imbalance. When one person consistently gives more attention, more emotional energy, more effort, silence becomes a way to restore equilibrium, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as self-correction. It is the moment someone realizes that their presence has become too available, their emotions too accessible, their value too easily assumed. Pulling back is not about making the other person feel absence. It is about reminding oneself of worth. Silence here functions as a mirror, revealing what remains when the noise is removed. Most importantly, silence can exist alongside love. Deep, restrained, unexpressed love that understands timing, context, and consequence. Love that knows that proximity without reciprocity leads to erosion of self. In such cases, silence is an act of maturity. It acknowledges that not every feeling needs to be voiced, not every attachment needs to be pursued, and not every connection is meant to be forced into existence. Silence becomes the language of emotional intelligence, where restraint speaks louder than pursuit and self-awareness outweighs impulse. Emotionally mature women don't chase uncertainty because they understand the psychological cost of investing in what is unclear, inconsistent, or unstable. They have learned, often through experience, that confusion is not a phase to be endured, but a signal to be acknowledged. When interest is genuine, it does not require decoding. When intention is sincere, it does not fluctuate without explanation. Emotional maturity brings the ability to recognize that uncertainty is not mysterious or romantic. It is simply a lack of clarity, and clarity is a basic requirement for emotional safety. Rather than rushing to fill in the gaps left by someone else's indecision, emotionally mature women allow those gaps to remain visible. They do not overinterpret mixed signals or excuse inconsistency as complexity. If communication is sporadic, if effort appears only when convenient, if affection comes without reliability, they do not chase harder in the hope of being chosen. Chasing uncertainty demands emotional labor that is rarely reciprocated, and maturity teaches that love should not feel like a constant negotiation for attention. Stability is not boring to someone who understands its value. It is grounding. There is a quiet confidence in choosing not to pursue what does not meet you halfway. Emotionally mature women recognize that their time, energy, and emotional availability are finite resources. They understand that repeatedly reaching out to someone who is unsure slowly erodes self-worth, even when intentions are good. Uncertainty keeps a person emotionally suspended, always waiting, always hoping, always adjusting. Maturity is the realization that no connection is worth existing in a perpetual state of emotional limbo. If clarity cannot be offered freely, distance becomes the healthier choice. This does not mean emotionally mature women are avoidant or unwilling to invest. On the contrary, they invest deeply when there is mutual presence and emotional consistency. What they avoid is the imbalance created when one person is emotionally present while the other remains ambiguous. They know that chasing uncertainty often disguises itself as patience or understanding, but over time it becomes self-abandonment. Emotional maturity involves knowing when patience is a virtue and when it is simply delaying an inevitable disappointment. Uncertainty also tests boundaries, and emotionally mature women are attentive to how their boundaries are respected. When someone remains vague about their intentions, it forces the other person to adapt constantly, often at the expense of their own needs. Instead of shrinking themselves to fit into someone else's indecision, mature women step back. They do not demand clarity through pressure or ultimatums. They create clarity through absence. By removing themselves from the equation, they allow reality to reveal itself without distortion. At its core, not chasing uncertainty is an act of self-trust. It reflects an understanding that love should feel steady, not anxiety-driven. Emotionally mature women trust their intuition when something feels off, even if nothing explicitly wrong has happened. They listen to discomfort instead of rationalizing it away. They choose peace over potential, certainty over possibility, and emotional integrity over the fleeting validation of being temporarily desired. Distance can be an act of self-respect when closeness begins to demand emotional compromise. Many people associate distance with coldness, punishment, or emotional withdrawal. But in emotionally aware individuals, distance is often a conscious decision to preserve inner balance. When a connection starts to feel one-sided, draining, or confusing, stepping back is not an act of rejection, but an acknowledgement of personal limits. Self-respect is rooted in the ability to recognize when a situation no longer aligns with one's emotional needs, and distance becomes the space where that recognition is honored rather than ignored. Choosing distance requires clarity and courage because it often goes against emotional impulse. The natural response to discomfort in a relationship is to seek reassurance, to explain oneself more, to offer more effort in hopes of restoring closeness. But self-respect intervenes when that effort is no longer met with reciprocity. Distance in this sense is not silence born from indifference, it is silence born from awareness. It is the decision to stop overextending emotionally in places where one's presence is taken for granted. Creating distance is a way of saying that one's emotional availability is valuable and should not be continuously offered without consideration. Distance also protects identity. When emotional investment becomes excessive in an unstable dynamic, individuals often begin to lose their sense of self. Thoughts revolve around the other person's behavior, moods, and responses. Emotional energy becomes externally focused, leaving little room for self-reflection or growth. By creating distance, a person recenters their attention inward. This space allows emotions to settle, perspectives to sharpen, and self-worth to be reaffirmed independent of another person's validation. Distance restores autonomy where emotional entanglement once blurred it. There is also a profound honesty in distance. Rather than forcing connection where clarity is absent, distance allows reality to surface naturally. It removes the pressure to perform, to impress, or to maintain an emotional role that may not be sustainable. In this way, distance is not manipulation, it is transparency. It communicates that connection should feel mutual, not strained or uncertain. Self-respect refuses to participate in dynamics that rely on ambiguity or emotional imbalance, and distance becomes the natural response to that refusal. Distance can be especially powerful when it replaces emotional pleading. Instead of asking repeatedly for effort, presence, or consistency, stepping back allows actions to speak louder than words. It reveals whether the connection was rooted in genuine interest or convenience. This form of distance is not meant to provoke guilt or fear, but to establish self-alignment. It allows individuals to observe rather than chase, to assess rather than assume. Self-respect understands that if someone values you, they will notice your absence without needing to be reminded of your worth. Ultimately, distance affirms personal standards. It is the quiet assertion that emotional health matters, that love should not require constant self-sacrifice, and that peace is not negotiable. Distance becomes an expression of maturity, not emotional detachment. It reflects an understanding that staying in situations that diminish self-worth is more harmful than stepping away from those that do not honor it. Through distance, self-respect is no longer an abstract concept, but a lived practice, maintained through conscious choice rather than emotional reaction. Indifference is effortless. Restraint is not, and understanding the difference requires emotional intelligence. When someone truly feels nothing, there is no internal conflict involved in their absence. They do not think twice before not replying, not showing up, or not engaging. Indifference does not demand self-control because there is nothing to control. It is emotionally neutral, free of tension, and uncomplicated. Restraint, on the other hand, is heavy. It is the presence of feeling combined with the conscious decision not to act on it. It involves awareness, discipline, and an understanding of consequence. Where indifference is passive, restraint is active. Restraint requires someone to acknowledge their emotions fully while choosing not to express them impulsively. This is not suppression, but regulation. It is knowing that speaking, reaching out, or pursuing would satisfy a momentary emotional urge, but might compromise long-term emotional well-being. People who practice restraint are often deeply aware of their emotional capacity and limits. They feel the desire to connect, to clarify, to move closer, but they also recognize when that desire is not matched by stability or reciprocity. Choosing restraint means prioritizing emotional health over immediate gratification. Unlike indifference, restraint comes with internal struggle. There is often a constant dialogue between the heart and the mind. The heart pulls toward expression, closeness, and vulnerability, while the mind evaluates safety, timing, and balance. This tension is invisible to others, which is why restraint is often misinterpreted as disinterest. From the outside, silence and distance look the same, whether they come from apathy or self-control. But internally, restraint is emotionally demanding. It requires sitting with unexpressed feelings, tolerating discomfort, and resisting the urge to seek reassurance. Restraint is also closely tied to self-respect. It is the ability to pause before investing further in situations that feel uncertain or emotionally uneven. Rather than chasing validation or clarity, restrained individuals allow space to reveal truth. They understand that constantly pursuing someone who is ambiguous only deepens emotional imbalance. Restraint becomes a protective measure, not against love, but against emotional erosion. It ensures that emotional energy is not depleted in environments where it is not valued or returned. There is a maturity in recognizing that not every feeling requires action. Emotional depth does not always demand expression. Sometimes the most responsible choice is to hold back, to observe, and to let time clarify what emotions alone cannot. Restraint honors the idea that love and interest should not be forced into existence through effort alone. It respects the natural rhythm of connection, where mutuality unfolds without pressure. Restraint also preserves dignity. When someone refrains from repeatedly reaching out, explaining themselves, or seeking reassurance, they maintain a sense of self intact. Indifference loses nothing by doing nothing, but restraint protects something precious by choosing less. It is a form of emotional strength that often goes unnoticed because it is quiet and internal. Restraint does not announce itself or seek recognition. It simply exists as a deliberate choice made in the presence of feeling, guided by awareness rather than impulse. Love without boundaries leads to self-loss because emotional connection, when left unchecked, slowly begins to replace personal identity. At first, the absence of boundaries can feel like devotion, openness, or emotional generosity. Giving freely, being constantly available, prioritizing another person's needs over your own can feel like proof of love. But over time, this unrestricted giving blurs the line between care and self-erasure. When love demands constant emotional access, the individual begins to measure their worth through the relationship rather than through their own values, goals, and sense of self. Without boundaries, emotions begin to revolve entirely around the other person's behavior. Mood becomes dependent on how they respond, how often they reach out, and how present they choose to be. This emotional dependency is subtle at first, often mistaken for attachment or closeness. Gradually, personal needs are postponed, personal limits ignored, and personal discomfort minimized to preserve the connection. The individual adapts repeatedly, shifting expectations and standards in order to keep the relationship intact, even when it becomes emotionally unbalanced. In doing so, they begin to lose clarity about what they need, what they deserve, and what feels emotionally safe. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the structure that allows love to exist without consuming the self. When boundaries are absent, love becomes expansive in the wrong direction, extending outward while leaving the inner self unprotected. Emotional exhaustion follows, not because love is inherently draining, but because it is being offered without regulation. The person gives more than they can sustainably provide, believing that love requires sacrifice without limit. This belief leads to resentment, confusion, and a quiet sense of emptiness, even when the relationship continues. Self-loss occurs when someone becomes more focused on maintaining connection than maintaining integrity. They may silence their discomfort, rationalize inconsistency, or tolerate uncertainty in order to avoid conflict or abandonment. Over time, this creates a disconnect between inner truth and outward behavior. The individual knows something feels off but continues anyway, convincing themselves that love should endure discomfort. This disconnect erodes self-trust, making it harder to recognize when a relationship no longer aligns with emotional well-being. Healthy boundaries create emotional distinction. They allow individuals to love deeply while remaining grounded in their own identity. Without them, love becomes enmeshment, where separation feels threatening and autonomy feels selfish. The absence of boundaries makes it difficult to differentiate between compromise and self-sacrifice. Love begins to feel overwhelming rather than supportive, intense rather than secure. The individual may struggle to imagine life outside the relationship, not because it is fulfilling, but because their sense of self has become intertwined with the other person's presence. Boundaries preserve choice. They ensure that love is offered willingly, not out of fear, obligation, or emotional dependence. When boundaries are honored, love becomes a mutual exchange rather than a one-sided surrender. Without them, love demands more than it gives, slowly dismantling the self in the process. Self-loss is not always dramatic or immediate. It is gradual, marked by the quiet disappearance of personal voice, personal space, and personal emotional truth. Love without boundaries leads to self-loss because emotional connection, when left unchecked, slowly begins to replace personal identity. At first, the absence of boundaries can feel like devotion, openness, or emotional generosity. Giving freely, being constantly available, prioritizing another person's needs over your own can feel like proof of love. But over time, this unrestricted giving blurs the line between care and self-erasure. When love demands constant emotional access, the individual begins to measure their worth through the relationship rather than through their own values, goals, and sense of self. Without boundaries, emotions begin to revolve entirely around the other person's behavior. Mood becomes dependent on how they respond, how often they reach out, and how present they choose to be. This emotional dependency is subtle at first, often mistaken for attachment or closeness. Gradually, personal needs are postponed, personal limits ignored, and personal discomfort minimized to preserve the connection. The individual adapts repeatedly, shifting expectations and standards in order to keep the relationship intact, even when it becomes emotionally unbalanced. In doing so, they begin to lose clarity about what they need, what they deserve, and what feels emotionally safe. Boundaries are not barriers to love. They are the structure that allows love to exist without consuming the self. When boundaries are absent, love becomes expansive in the wrong direction, extending outward while leaving the inner self unprotected. Emotional exhaustion follows, not because love is inherently draining, but because it is being offered without regulation. The person gives more than they can sustainably provide, believing that love requires sacrifice without limit. This belief leads to resentment, confusion, and a quiet sense of emptiness, even when the relationship continues. Self-loss occurs when someone becomes more focused on maintaining connection than maintaining integrity. They may silence their discomfort, rationalize inconsistency, or tolerate uncertainty in order to avoid conflict or abandonment. Over time, this creates a disconnect between inner truth and outward behavior. The individual knows something feels off but continues anyway, convincing themselves that love should endure discomfort. This disconnect erodes self-trust, making it harder to recognize when a relationship no longer aligns with emotional well-being. Healthy boundaries create emotional distinction. They allow individuals to love deeply while remaining grounded in their own identity. Without them, love becomes enmeshment, where separation feels threatening and autonomy feels selfish. The absence of boundaries makes it difficult to differentiate between compromise and self-sacrifice. Love begins to feel overwhelming rather than supportive, intense rather than secure. The individual may struggle to imagine life outside the relationship, not because it is fulfilling, but because their sense of self has become intertwined with the other person's presence. Boundaries preserve choice. They ensure that love is offered willingly, not out of fear, obligation, or emotional dependence. When boundaries are honored, love becomes a mutual exchange rather than a one-sided surrender. Without them, love demands more than it gives, slowly dismantling the self in the process. Self-loss is not always dramatic or immediate. It is gradual, marked by the quiet disappearance of personal voice, personal space, and personal emotional truth. Calm withdrawal often signals deep feelings because it is rarely an impulsive or careless reaction. When someone withdraws without anger, without accusations, and without dramatic expression, it suggests a high level of emotional awareness. This type of withdrawal is not driven by indifference, but by internal regulation. Deep feelings create vulnerability, and vulnerability requires safety. When safety feels uncertain, emotionally aware individuals do not escalate, they step back. This calm retreat is a way of containing emotion rather than allowing it to spill into situations where it may not be held with care. Unlike reactive distance, calm withdrawal carries intention. It is measured, thoughtful, and often painful for the person choosing it. Deep emotional attachment makes withdrawal difficult because the desire to stay connected remains strong. The absence of outward conflict does not indicate the absence of inner conflict. On the contrary, calm withdrawal often comes after significant reflection, where the individual has weighed their emotional needs against the reality of the situation. They may recognize that continuing to engage would deepen attachment without providing stability, and so they choose restraint over emotional exposure. Calm withdrawal is also rooted in self-respect. When someone feels deeply but notices inconsistency, emotional unavailability, or lack of reciprocity, they may choose distance rather than confrontation. This does not mean they are avoiding communication. It means they understand that clarity cannot always be forced. Instead of demanding reassurance or explanations, they create space. This space serves as a boundary, protecting their emotional integrity while allowing the other person's behavior to reveal its true nature without pressure. There is a misconception that strong feelings must be expressed loudly. In reality, emotional depth often comes with composure. People who feel intensely are often the ones who understand the consequences of emotional overexposure. They know that repeatedly expressing unmet needs can lead to self-diminishment. Calm withdrawal becomes a way of honoring feelings without sacrificing dignity. It allows emotions to exist without turning them into pleas or emotional negotiations. Calm withdrawal also reflects emotional maturity in recognizing limits. When love or attachment is present but conditions are not supportive, stepping back prevents resentment from forming. It is easier to withdraw calmly than to stay and grow bitter. This choice preserves the emotional quality of the feeling, even if the connection itself cannot continue in the same way. Withdrawal here is not about creating distance to provoke a reaction, but about preventing emotional damage to oneself. Often, calm withdrawal is misunderstood by those on the receiving end. It may be seen as disinterest or emotional detachment, when in reality, it is the opposite. The lack of drama masks the depth of emotion involved. Calm withdrawal does not announce its pain, it carries it quietly. It allows the individual to grieve the connection internally while maintaining external composure. This quiet dignity is not a sign of emotional absence, but of emotional strength, where feelings are acknowledged, respected, and carefully contained rather than acted upon impulsively.